The autumn wind cut through the Cascade Mountains with a sharpness that felt almost personal. October 2009 brought an early chill to Washington state, and the Douglas firs swayed under heavy gray skies that promised rain. Marcus Delacroix and his wife Eleanor had driven 3 hours from Seattle to tackle the Thornwood Trail, a moderate 14-mile loop known for its waterfalls and ridge views. They were experienced hikers. Marcus had been climbing since college, and Elena grew up camping with her father in Olympic National Park. Their car, a silver Honda CR-V, sat alone in the gravel parking lot when the Ranger drove past at dawn. By sunset, it would still be there. Marcus, 34, worked as a structural engineer. Elena, 31, taught 4th grade at a public school in Ballard. They'd been married 6 years and had planned this trip for weeks, marking it on their kitchen calendar with a small mountain sketch. Eleanor's younger brother, David, would later tell investigators that his sister had been excited but cautious. She'd checked the weather forecast 3 times and packed extra batteries for their headlamps. Marcus left a voicemail for his father the night before. "We'll be back by 5. Love you, Dad." They never came home. Before we continue with this mystery, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's dive deeper into what happened that October day. The alarm was raised when Marcus failed to show up for a Monday morning site inspection. His project manager called twice, then contacted Elena's school. By Monday afternoon, David was standing in the parking lot at the Thornwood trailhead, staring at his sister's car. The doors were locked. Through the window, he could see Elena's purse on the passenger seat, her phone inside it. Marcus's wallet sat in the center console. The ranger station launched a search that evening. For 9 days, search and rescue teams combed the area. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the forest. Volunteers from 3 counties walked shoulder to shoulder through the underbrush, calling their names until their voices went hoarse. Bloodhounds picked up a scent near the trailhead, but lost it after half a mile. Near a creek crossing where the path split into 2 directions. One route climbed toward Thornwood Peak, the other descended into a valley thick with old-growth forest and Devil's Club. The searchers found nothing. No clothing, no backpack, no sign of struggle. It was as if Marcus and Elena had stepped off the trail and vanished into the mountain itself. The case went cold within months, filed away with dozens of other unsolved disappearances in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. David never stopped searching. He printed flyers and posted them in every ranger station, campground, and hiking supply store from Portland to the Canadian border. He hiked Thornwood Trail himself 17 times over the years, sometimes alone, sometimes with other families who'd lost loved ones to the mountains. Elena's father, Vincent, a retired firefighter, spent his savings hiring private investigators. None of them found anything new. The official theory was that Marcus and Elena had gotten lost, possibly injured, and succumbed to exposure during a storm that moved through the area on their 2nd day missing. But Vincent never believed it. "Elena knew those woods," he said in a 2011 interview with a Seattle newspaper. "She wouldn't have just wandered off the trail." Something happened to them. By 2023, the case had faded from public memory. David was 41, married with 2 daughters. He'd learned to live with the uncertainty, though he still kept a photo of Elena on his desk at work, her laughing face bright against a backdrop of alpine meadows from a trip they'd taken to Mount Rainier years before she disappeared. Vincent had passed away in 2020, his final words to David a whisper, "Find your sister." Then, in late August 2023, a drone pilot named Colin Hartley changed everything. Colin was 28, a freelance videographer who specialized in aerial footage for real estate companies and tourism boards. He'd been hired by a conservation group to document old mining sites in the Cascades for a restoration project. The work took him deep into areas rarely visited by hikers, places where logging roads had been reclaimed by moss and ferns, where elk trails wound through meadows no one had walked in decades. He flew his drone over ravines and ridgelines, capturing footage of crumbling wooden structures and rusted equipment half buried in the earth. On August 23rd, Colin launched his drone from a ridge above the Thornwood Trail system. He was documenting a collapsed mine entrance about 4 miles off the main path, accessible only by bushwhacking through dense forest. The drone climbed to 300 feet, its camera panning across the canopy. Colin watched the live feed on his controller screen, guiding the drone toward a clearing he'd spotted on satellite images. That's when he saw it. The drone's camera caught something blue among the trees. A splash of color that didn't belong in the palette of greens and browns. Colin brought the drone lower, hovering above a steep ravine, thick with salmonberry and alder. The blue object was fabric, a tent, he realized, or what remained of one. It was wedged between 2 massive boulders at the bottom of a 30-foot drop, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. Nearby, scattered among the rocks, were other items. A twisted metal frame that might have been a backpack, fragments of bright orange that could have been a rain jacket. Colin's hands were shaking as he captured the footage. He'd heard stories of missing hikers in these mountains, everyone had. He marked the GPS coordinates and flew the drone back, then spent the next hour hiking down into the ravine. The terrain was brutal, nearly vertical in places, choked with thorny undergrowth. When he finally reached the site, he stopped 10 feet away. He could see more clearly now, a collapsed tent, shredded by time and weather, a boot partially buried in soil and pine needles, and something else, a white shape among the rocks that made his stomach turn. Colin didn't go any closer. He climbed back to the ridge and called 911. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office dispatched a recovery team the next morning. Detective Laura Brennan, who'd worked missing persons cases for 19 years, led the investigation. She'd been a rookie deputy when Marcus and Elena disappeared, and she remembered the search, the long days, the grief-stricken family, the frustrating lack of evidence. When she saw Colin's drone footage, she knew immediately what they'd found. The recovery took 2 days. The ravine was treacherous, and the remains were scattered across a wide area, some pieces wedged under fallen logs, others carried downhill by years of runoff and erosion. The forensics team worked carefully, documenting everything. They found 2 sets of skeletal remains, badly decomposed but largely intact. They found a backpack with Marcus's driver's license inside, protected by a waterproof pocket. They found Eleanor's wedding ring, still on her finger bone. They found a journal, its pages stuck together and mostly illegible, but with Eleanor's name written on the inside cover. The medical examiner's report would take weeks, but the preliminary findings painted a picture. Marcus had suffered a fractured skull and multiple broken bones, consistent with a fall. Elena's injuries were similar: fractured ribs, a broken femur, trauma to her pelvis. The ravine was nearly invisible from the trail, hidden behind a curtain of dense forest. The leading theory was that they'd wandered off trail, possibly disoriented by fog or rain, and stepped over an edge they couldn't see until it was too late. The fall would have been catastrophic. In that isolated ravine, their calls for help would have echoed against stone walls, unheard by anyone. Detective Brennan called David on a Tuesday morning. She was gentle, her voice steady as she explained what they'd found. David listened in silence, his phone pressed against his ear, standing in his garage where his daughters wouldn't hear him cry. When Brennan finished, he asked only one question: did they suffer? Brennan told him the truth. They would have died from their injuries within hours, possibly faster. It was a small mercy, but it was something. The news broke on local stations that evening, then spread to national media within days. The story captured attention because of its tragic resolution. 14 years of uncertainty, finally answered by technology that hadn't existed when Marcus and Eleanor first vanished. Drone pilots across the country began volunteering their equipment and expertise to cold case searches, forming networks to scan wilderness areas where traditional search methods had failed. Colin Hartley struggled with what he'd found. He gave interviews, but he looked uncomfortable on camera, his eyes distant. "I was just doing my job," he said repeatedly. "I wish I could have found them alive." The conservation group suspended their mining documentation project for 2 weeks, offering Colin counseling and time off. He eventually returned to work, but he never flew his drone over the Cascade Mountains again. David organized a memorial service at a small church in Ballard, the same church where Marcus and Elena had been married 14 years earlier. More than 200 people attended. Friends, former students of Elena's, colleagues of Marcus's, and strangers who'd followed the case for years. David stood at the podium, holding a photo of his sister on her wedding day, and spoke about the relief of finally knowing. "For 14 years, we've been trapped in that moment when they didn't come home," he said, his voice breaking. "Now we can let them rest." But questions remained. The journal Elena had carried was sent to a forensics lab that specialized in document recovery. Using specialized imaging techniques, technicians were able to read portions of the water-damaged pages. What they found added new layers to the tragedy. Elena had written entries during their hike and in the hours after the fall. The first entries were cheerful. Descriptions of the trail, a joke Marcus had made about forgetting the coffee filters, excitement about reaching the ridge viewpoint. But the final entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, told a different story. They'd left the main trail to investigate what Marcus thought was a shortcut to a viewpoint marked on an old map he'd found online. The map was outdated, created before trail maintenance crews had rerouted sections of the path. They'd pushed through thick underbrush for 20 minutes before realizing they were lost. When they tried to backtrack, the fog rolled in, thick and disorienting, reducing visibility to a few feet. Elena wrote that they'd decided to wait it out, but Marcus had spotted what looked like the trail below them through a gap in the trees. He'd stepped forward to get a better look, and the ground gave way beneath him. He fell, and Elena, trying to grab him, went over the edge too. The journal's final, legible entry was dated 3 days after they'd left for their hike. Elena wrote that Marcus had died the night before, his breathing growing shallow and then stopping while she held his hand in the darkness of their collapsed tent. Her own leg was broken, and she couldn't climb out of the ravine. She tried to signal with her emergency whistle, but no one came. The entry ended mid-sentence. "I can hear water somewhere close, and I'm so—" The rest was unreadable, but Elena's family understood. She'd survived for at least 3 days, alone with her husband's body, knowing she was going to die. The thought was unbearable. Detective Brennan included the journal excerpts in her final report, but she didn't release them to the media. Some details, she believed, belonged only to the family. David read them once, alone in his living room after his wife and daughters had gone to bed. He folded the report and put it in a drawer, and he never opened it again. The Thornwood Trail remained open, but the county installed new warning signs at the trailhead and at major junctions. The signs featured photos of Marcus and Eleanor and a simple message: "Stay on marked trails. The wilderness is beautiful but unforgiving." Hikers began leaving flowers at the trailhead, small bouquets that appeared and disappeared with the seasons. Someone carved their initials into a wooden post, MD and ED, surrounded by a heart. Colin Hartley's discovery prompted changes beyond the trail itself. The National Park Service launched a pilot program using drone technology to search for missing persons in wilderness areas. Within the first year, the program helped locate remains in 4 cold cases, bringing closure to families who'd been waiting decades for answers. Colin was invited to speak at conferences about search and rescue technology, though he always deflected credit. "I was lucky," he'd say. "I happened to be in the right place." David visited the ravine once, guided by a ranger who knew the terrain. The hike took 4 hours, and when they reached the spot where his sister had died, David stood silently for a long time, looking at the boulders and the overgrown vegetation. He imagined Elena's final days, her fear and pain, and he wept. But he also felt something unexpected: gratitude. She wasn't lost anymore. She was found. He could bring her home. Marcus and Elena were cremated, and their ashes were scattered at Deception Pass, a place they'd loved, where the water churned through narrow channels and eagles circled overhead. David stood on the bridge with his wife and daughters, with Marcus's elderly father, with Elena's friends from school, and he poured the ashes into the wind. They drifted down toward the water, grey against blue. And then they were gone. In the years that followed, David became an advocate for wilderness safety education. He partnered with outdoor organizations to teach navigation skills and promote proper preparation for backcountry trips. He showed Elena's photo at workshops, telling her story not as a warning, but as a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, even for experienced hikers. "My sister loved these mountains," he'd say. "She respected them. But respect isn't always enough. You need knowledge, preparation, and a little bit of luck." Landed, the silver Honda CR-V that had sat in the Thornwood Trail parking lot for 9 days in 2009 was eventually sold by the family. David couldn't bring himself to drive it, couldn't sit in the seats where Marcus and Elena had sat on their last morning, excited for a day in the mountains. A young couple bought it, unaware of its history. They drove it to trailheads all over Washington, their own adventures unfolding in the same vehicle that had marked the beginning of a 14-year mystery. Detective Brennan retired in 2024, but she kept a folder on her desk until her last day, the Marcus and Elena case. She'd been haunted by it, by the not knowing, and finding their remains had given her a sense of completion she hadn't expected. At her retirement party, she told colleagues that it was the most meaningful case she'd ever closed, not because of detective work, but because technology and chance had finally aligned to give a family peace. On the anniversary of their discovery, David returned to Deception Pass with his daughters, now teenagers. They stood on the bridge, looking out at the water, and David told them stories about their Aunt Elena, how she taught him to tie knots for rock climbing, how she cried at sappy movies, how she'd wanted children of her own someday. His daughters listened, and they understood that grief wasn't something you got over, but something you learned to carry differently. The mountains kept their secrets, but this time they'd given one back. Marcus and Elena were no longer among the lost. They were remembered, mourned, and finally, after 14 years, they were home.